Hello everyone. We are going to go through a couple of points that are made in Chapter 1 of your textbook. In fact, Chapter 1 of your textbook is split into two parts. The first part talks about why data are sometimes referred to instead of data is as data are, and we'll go through that point briefly. Then we'll spend the rest of this video going through the second point that is made, and that is why are all data local? Going back to the first point, why do some people refer to data in the plural sense? Well, in fact, that is technically and grammatically correct in the old tradition. Data is actually the plural form of the word datum. Datum is a single piece of data, so data would be the plural form of datum, meaning lots of datums. You'll have data. Okay, so a single datum and many datums equal data. So technically, data are is correct. But the plural nature of data has largely been abandoned in common language. Our language evolves, and in many ways things get changed, and sometimes things that aren't necessarily technically or grammatically correct get adopted through kind of popular adoption as becoming standard. And that's what's happened here when we say data is. In most instances now, you're going to hear the word data associated with is instead of are. And again, that's because of that shift in language. The one holdout is the sciences. The sciences still say data are, and so if you've ever worked in biotech or in other scientific fields and you're working with a lot of data, you'll hear researchers talking about the data are or the data show. And that's kind of odd for us to hear sometimes because it sounds to us to be grammatically incorrect. But in fact, in the old tradition, it is grammatically correct. But I just want to make sure that you understand the point that you're likely to hear this in both ways. And when you hear data are, consider the source. Oftentimes it will be a more technical, more scientific source that is actually using the term in that way. That is why the title of our textbook is All Data Are Local. And I think it's helping the author make his points. And the author, of course, is an academic who has worked in data sets and data fields. So he's probably quite used to using the term are in reference to data. But I think as we get through this course and as you read more of his textbook, you'll start to see how he's using that format to help him make his points. So what are those points that he's trying to make? Well, let's shift over to talk about why data are local and what he means by data being local. And let's get back to sort of kind of a definition of what we think data really is. We often see data as a definitive information source. You know, we'll hear things like it's in the data, or it's supported by the data, or it's proven by the data. But we have to, and we hear that actually a lot in things like science, technology, social science, and business. And increasingly, data is everywhere. We're generating data all the time. And it's either being generated, for commercial purposes, or it's generated for scientific purposes, or it's generated through social media and captured and used. Ultimately, much of the data that's being generated now is being used to drive economic gain on the parts of companies that are either generating the data or that are capturing the data and selling the data. One of the things that's going on also right now is that the world is going through a process, in a lot of cases, going through something called datafication. And loosely defined, datafication is the process of turning anything into a structured data set. So something you might not even think about, like the shape of leaves on trees. Suddenly we're going through some process. We're going to turn that into something that can be a nice structured data set so that we can run a number of different tools in order to be able to better understand that data set. What's happened in large part is that we have a series of tools that we have generated over the years, a series of processes that we've generated over the years, whether they be technology or statistical, that work really, really well with nice, clean, structured data sets. But it's a lot harder when we're not dealing with nice, clean, structured data sets. So instead of adopting or adapting tools to be able to deal with non-structured data, one other method is to take the data and turn it into something that is much more clean and structured. And so we're seeing that happening, and that's really what datafication, the process of datafication means, is turning something that we wouldn't normally track, something that we wouldn't normally be able to track, turning it into something that looks like data that we can track using the existing tools that we have. When you think of data sets, there's really two general types of data sets, two general categories of data. One of which we can refer to as quantitative. And quantitative data is more easily structured, and it's more easy to fit into the current existing tools. And those would be things like financial data, sales data, scientific data, business data, that kind of stuff. Stuff that we would normally drop out into a nice Excel spreadsheet format or a nice Oracle database, and it's clean and easy to follow. We also think of qualitative. And qualitative is harder to structure. And the reason why qualitative is the term that I want to use is that qualitative allows us to learn qualities about a certain phenomenon or a certain data set. So we're going to learn qualities about something, and that could be how people feel about a topic. It could be information that is captured in text messages and social media. It could also be motivations for people's behavior. Not only is the actual behavior important for the datafication process, but what led to that motivation could tell us a great deal about the different values of the data. So with datafication, we still have to turn qualitative data into structured data. And when we do that, it comes at a bit of a price. So right now we're in a data revolution, and that is data is driving so many things. So there's so much data being generated through social media, through the internet, even what gets captured at your store when you use your local loyalty card. All that information is going somewhere, and it's being used in a number of different ways. And if you've watched the videos that have been posted on the data revolution, you'll see kind of some ways in which that data is being generated and how it's being used. But our current data sources only tell part of the story. So when we have data, we can learn a lot about what people are doing, and it's getting better that we can learn a lot about some of the secondary factors that are driving what people are doing. But it's important for us to realize that the data that we're able to look at is really a limited set of the data that's out there. The structured data set that I refer to before as quantitative data, that is actually becoming less and less of the overall data landscape. That's because there's just so much more non-structured data being produced every day. So when we have the nice structured data, that's fine and it's useful and it helps us. When we're able to use datafication to convert non-structured data into a structured format, that helps us as well. But it doesn't solve the problem of the fact that there is so much data being generated in text format, video format, and other types of formats that just is not easily put into a clean structured format for analysis. So we have to be able to come up with solutions to those problems. And if we're going to store and mine and analyze the data that comes in, text or video or whatever, that means it needs to be converted into a structured format, and it needs to be run through datafication. But the problem is what gets lost when we run something, convert something that is in a qualitative format into a nice structured, clean data structure where it's easy to analyze. The problem is, how do we account for things like feelings and emotions and motivations and aesthetics and other factors that are tied to the actual numbers themselves, or tied to the actual structured data? So how do we make sure that we have a good representation of the truth? So we have to remember that datafication actually reduces our data, because when we're forcing something to be fit into a nice structured, clean format, we basically just shave off all the stuff that we can't convert into a nice, clean, structured format, and some of what we shave off is really important to understanding the actual meaning of the data. Another concept that we think about when we talk about data these days is big data. And so what do they mean by big? Well, what they basically mean by big is, with so much data being generated and captured, what do we do with it? And it used to be a big problem for us because local companies had a certain number of servers and a certain amount of storage capacity. And the data rapidly, when they started, the data revolution came and they started gathering all this data, the data rapidly overran their capacity to not only store it, but to be able to do any real good processing on it. The data sets were just too large. So instead of going out and spending millions of dollars on acquiring additional storage capacity and additional servers, there's two things that kind of happened and changed this whole landscape. Actually three. One of which, the prices for both servers and storage did come down, and so that did allow for more local processing, more local storage of the data within a company's walls. But what really happened was the explosion of cloud computing. And cloud computing has really made a huge difference in the sense that as an organization, I can enjoy all of the benefits of the data revolution, meaning I can gather data and I can process data, but I don't have to go out and spend thousands or millions of dollars on new servers and storage capacity, because I can use something like Amazon Web Services or the services provided by Google or Microsoft or other companies, where I basically store all of my data on their cloud, and I do much of the back-end processing on their cloud, so I don't have to go out and buy all these expensive pieces of equipment in order to be able to work with my data. So cloud computing has made a huge difference in the sense that we're able now to process data, these giant data sets, in ways that we weren't even able to do just maybe 10 years ago. So in that sense, the term big data is sort of falling out of favor. Big data really represented the point at which something became big something became big data when it exceeded the capacity of a company to be able to process it. That's really kind of a loose definition of what big data was. But with the transparency of being able to integrate into something like a cloud hosted by Amazon Web Services, where I can just dump all my data out to the cloud and I can do a lot of my backend processing on the cloud, it's almost as if all that is stored locally. The speed of the internet, the speed of the processing, and the power of the cloud allows me to act as if I'm being able to process way beyond my capacity, my local capacity, as if it was in fact local. So the new data revolution, with so much data being stored, big data is the new standard. Everybody's doing it. And so big data isn't just big data anymore. It's just kind of data. There's no really big about it. It's just what everybody's doing. But no matter how big data gets or how much we gather, store, and analyze, a data set can never fully capture all that it's meant to represent. So what do we mean by that? We have to think once again of data as a snapshot. We can gather a data set. It can even be a big data set. But what it's actually going to be is going to be a picture of a part of the world at a given time. It does not capture many of the qualities that are associated with the data. And something, you've heard the term lost in translation. Well, something is lost in datafication. When we datafy something, we're losing certain qualities that are associated with the data. And some of those qualities can be local qualities that are very much a part of the data, very much influence the generation, storage, and analysis of the data. But when we drop that into a datafied set, we may lose some of those factors. Still, we tend to regard data as a lasting picture of something. We can attribute more value and more permanence to our data. And I give the example of a set of data that was gathered in early 2016, maybe January of 2016. We may stumble across that data referred to in an article or a news story. Some years later, it could be May of 2019, and draw conclusions based on the data that was gathered almost 3.5 years ago. And that's what I mean by giving more value and permanence to our data. If the data was a snapshot, it was a snapshot of what was going on in January of 2016. 3.5 years later, it may not be relevant at all. It may no longer be applicable to the actual thing it's supposed to represent. So, but we tend to disregard that. We tend to not look at that. There's so many things that are shifting and changing in the world that when we capture a data set about a particular phenomena, we have to really look at the timestamp of when that data was gathered, and then take into account that things can shift and change. So we also tend to give our data more power than we should because of that, because we tend to believe in the data too much. So let's consider an example. I'm going to use the World Health Organization data set as an example. The World Health Organization captures data on health, population, education, economic status, and a whole bunch of other things of citizens in every country in the world. And the World Health Organization data set, which you can actually find out on the internet, it consists of, or tracks to the best of its ability, numeric representations of 358 variables for all 212 countries in the world. Okay? So that data is used in a number of different ways throughout the world. The World Health Organization is kind of a big deal, right? And so a lot of countries are using the World Health Organization's data sets to, set up for non-governmental organizations, to provide aid to countries, to a whole bunch of other stuff, development into countries. Economic development can be driven by countries who've seen changes in their economic status. So the data are used in a number of different ways throughout the world. Okay, one of the first fields in the data set, I think it's field number 5, is the literacy rates. And literacy rates is basically, it's a percentage. And it's a percentage on a scale of 1 to 100, and it's supposed to represent the percentage of people who can read and write in a particular country. Okay, so if we gather that data about all 212 countries in the world, that's all we need to know about literacy, right? I'm not sure it is, actually. First things first that we need to think about is how accurate is that information? The world is a big place, and there's a lot of remote parts to it. So how did the World Health Organization gather that information? Did they gather it themselves? Did they take it from the local governments? How did the local governments gather that information? So we need to look at the data, and we need to look beyond the data and see how the data were gathered. Okay, and what do we mean by literacy? Are we defining it the same way across the entire world? In the U.S. and in the West, we think of literacy as somebody who can read or somebody who can pick up a pen and paper and write. But that may not be the same strict definition that is applied to all countries throughout the world. There are countries that actually practice oral traditions, and that's considered to be, in a lot of ways, the ability to communicate just as well as reading or writing. So what are we doing in situations like that where we actually are discounting something that is just as important of a communication factor as reading or writing. So that third point there is that what Western or American biases are we placing on this number? Are we discounting the oral traditions? Are we discounting other ways of being able to communicate simply in favor of, a strict definition around reading and writing? The other thing is the point I was referring to earlier is how long will the number be accurate? Let's presume that we gathered a number that represents the percentage of people who can read and write in a particular country. How long is that going to be accurate? With so many things shifting and so many things changing and so many people working to improve literacy rates as we define them in the West, won't those data be out of date almost as soon as they're gathered? And so we have to think about that. We have to think about, if we're looking past the data and thinking about what's going into the data, how accurate is that data and how likely is it going to be accurate for a long period of time? A good example that I can give you on this one is that for a lot of years, the number was gathered, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a statistic that showed that 2.1 or something like that billion people lived below the poverty rate. And the poverty rate is $1.90 a day. Somebody could live on less than $2 a day. So that number was 2.1 billion, and that number was kind of shocking because at the time that was about a third of the planet that lived under the poverty rate. So a lot of work was done and a lot of effort was done, and that 2.1 billion number kind of hung around for a long time. Well, later on, when they decided that they were going to sort of update their numbers, they went out and found out that that number had dropped by almost 2/3. It was down to 0.8 billion or 800 million that were still living under $1.90 a day. While that's an alarming number, it just shows a dramatic shift in the space of 15 years, a dramatic shift in some of these statistics that are used to actually drive a whole lot of global action. So if we look at any one of these that are gathered by the World Health Organization and we see that it was gathered some number of years ago, how much has that changed? How much has that shifted? And are we giving full consideration to the fact that those numbers change all the time? Okay. So does that number say anything about efforts to improve literacy? And also, does it tell us anything about the loss of non-written forms of communication like I referred to earlier? So just remember that World Health Organization literacy rates are a snapshot of literacy rates at the time that they were gathered, okay? And they represent and are accurate for only a small period of time, especially with things that are shifting, okay? It represents a small story for each country, but it leaves a lot out, okay? It can be influenced by researcher bias. It can be influenced by local conditions. A literacy rate is a representation of a small localized international culture, okay? And for example, the literacy rate in Morocco is the product of much more than how many people can read and write. It's a product of local conditions, economic conditions, social conditions. They could be religious conditions. There could be all kinds of things that go into determining what a particular literacy rate is. And a literacy rate of, say, in the neighborhood of 70% for a particular country, while that might look, not as good as 100% in a Western country, and we may say, oh, there's work that needs to be done there. Literacy rate of 70% may be what the local culture supports. That may be as good as it's going to get because of certain cultural norms and traditions. So that is what's meant by all data are local. The data that were gathered for the country that represents 70% literacy rate, where that number is as good as it's going to get, that is a locally driven, locally influenced, and locally considered number. That when we datafy that information and we put it into a single variable, we lose the local factors that are so important in determining why the data are what they are. So you have to think of data as sort of an iceberg, right? And when we see the data, we're seeing the tip of the iceberg, okay? What we see are the data that the researcher has gathered and published, or what the media is showing, or what the newspaper is showing, or what the internet site is showing. We see basically what they want us to see. Okay, even if it's accurate, we don't see the whole story. What we don't see are all of the local, social, political, and human factors that drove the data to be what it is. Okay, so if we just look at the data, we miss so much of the local factors that drive the data to be what it is. We assume that the data are universal when in fact they are not universal. They are so local. They are so driven by local factors. So we need to consider those local factors when we assess data, and we need to see through the data and look at the local factors that make the data what it is. So all data are local, okay? We can use datafication to capture information about something, but remember, it's only a snapshot. And many things are lost in datafication. And some of those things that are lost are those local factors, okay? When we datafy, there are local factors that we lose. Expectations, culture, bias, social values, all those things that local things that went into determining what a particular data set or what a particular variable is, we lose all that when we datafy. And we have to remember that there's much more there than just the numbers that were being shown. Okay? So these local factors impact the data. They are part of the data. Okay? And we should not lose sight of them in the data revolution.